Hello, and on behalf of the Ancient Tree Forum, welcome to another webinar in the series covering the VetCert standard at practicing level. This session will cover Unit 8, which is about legislation, and Unit 9, which is about risk management in relation to veteran trees. Just a reminder, make a note of any questions or queries that you might have as you go along, and they can be picked up in the live Q&A sessions that complement this series of webinars. So Unit 8, Legislation and Official Guidance in Relation to Veteran Trees, that you ought to be able to demonstrate an understanding of the legislation affecting veteran tree management within the country of examination. I'd just like to make it clear that the VetCert practitioner is not expected to be a specialist in legislation and to be able to quote paragraphs in relation to the laws and the regulations. However, it's obviously clearly important that you have the applied knowledge and awareness of the relevant fields of legislation that affect and impact your work on veteran trees. So I guess what I mean by that is that you come to a tree and you find there's an owl nesting in that tree, that you should be aware of what impact that potentially has on your work. If it's a protected species, for example, that you ought to know that it will place restrictions on when you can undertake the work, and that you should either contact the consultant or the landowner about how you should deal with the situation. Because lack of knowledge or ignorance is no defence in the eyes of the law. So it is important that you have a basic understanding of the different sorts of legislation that might affect veteran trees. And some examples of those are, as I've said already, protected species, health and safety, of course, the standards in relation to tree work that are relevant for your particular area of work. There may be biosecurity regulations, other biodiversity protected species is one, but there may be also other types of legislation which vary from country to country as to the time of year you can work on trees. There may be in relation to the conservation areas, for example. So the historic environment may be protected at some level. So having a working understanding and demonstrating a level of awareness about the legislation. But as I've said, you wouldn't be expected to be able to quote paragraph and year of the legislation in relation to this type of work, but just have a basic understanding. And in direct relation to this, again, the point with VetCert was being a European certification scheme. It means that you could potentially go and work in a different country. However, you must be aware of the fact that if you work in a different, even region or country, the legislation in relation to veteran trees may differ. And I mean, this photograph here shows, it's called Naturdenkmal. I'm sure my pronunciation is absolutely terrible. But this is from Germany, and those trees are protected. It's a natural monument, and there's an equivalent in Sweden as well, Naturminnessträd, and those are protected, and there are very strict guidance about what you can and can't do in relation to that tree, and that you shouldn't make any assumptions about the legislation in other countries. If you do go and work with people in other countries, you should inform yourself of that information. And as I said, there may be differences in the EU directives as well, which may not be the case in the UK any longer, but are definitely relevant in other European countries. And it may not necessarily be the tree itself, but the fact that it's home to a protected species, of course. So inform yourself and be aware of the fact that there are differences. Now we have some fact sheets from different countries about legislation. They're in the language of that country, which might make it slightly more challenging. But there's several different countries, the Czech Republic, there's Sweden and the UK included there, and they're available to download. They're not exhaustive, but they give you a very good overview of the legislation that's relevant if you're not familiar. So on to Unit 9, Veteran Tree Risk Assessment. We would expect you to be able to demonstrate an understanding of tree risk assessment as applied to veteran trees. Now, tree risk management is often a standard part of tree work in most countries, but there are issues in relation to veteran tree management that are important to highlight. and that you should be able to identify the difference between the potential to cause harm, hazard, and the likelihood of a given severity of harm occurring, risk. So in other words, you should be able to identify that hazard is not the same as risk, and that hazard is something that may cause harm, but that may not be an issue if there's no risk. So risk in the sense of being a combination of the likelihood of, for example, if there's a very heavy decayed branch, the likelihood of that failing, and then the likelihood of there being a target present, as in someone or something under that particular branch at the moment at which it falls, and then how much harm would actually occur as a consequence. And then really important here is this kind of real risk versus perception of risk. That's incredibly important with regard to veteran trees, and being aware of that and being able to deal with it when talking to people. And that's something we've talked earlier about, this kind of these people skills, and we will come back to later on in one of the other units. And this is about common sense risk management, and that we are able to also highlight the benefits of veteran trees in relation to the potential risk. So there must be some kind of risk benefit value analysis, and whilst that level of detail is not expected of the practitioner, it's a useful thing to think about in relation to talking to people about this real versus the perception of risk. You would be expected to undertake a risk assessment of a veteran tree following a suitable methodology, and this again is your applied knowledge, and that you must, there's lots of different methods out there, and you should choose the one and make yourself familiar with the one that's appropriate for veteran trees. And we also are well aware that determining the likelihood of failure is quite challenging with veteran trees. But we would expect you to be looking at things like, where is the target and how frequent is the target, that they are more complex and therefore require a more complex method potentially. And it can be more challenging. So identifying and undertaking risk assessments can be more challenging, of course, with veteran trees than with younger trees. And then something that's really very important, and this is both for practicing and consulting level, is identifying options other than felling or cutting the tree in order to manage the risk. And these are kind of in a sort of order of importance here. The first and foremost would be do nothing if that's possible. And do nothing doesn't mean necessarily just, walking away. It may do, but often it involves some kind of monitoring in place. Target management would be step 2. Can you move the target? And then the third step in that would be relation to intervention on the tree. So we would be expecting at practicing level you to be able to understand other options other than felling and cutting the tree in terms of veteran tree management. And this is a kind of ethos in veteran tree management that's important to be clear about and that you would be expected to know. So now we've gone through those 2 units, which are relatively short, and there's some good resources there for these 2 units, and in particular in relation to risk. There's an older book, which is called Veteran Trees, A Guide to Risk and Responsibility, and that's available freely to download. Then, of course, the Common Sense Risk Management of Veteran Trees, which was produced as part of the Vet Tree project, and that was built on the National Tree Safety Guidance Handbook, which is currently being updated. But it's a very useful video, actually, and if there are other people that you're working with that are feeling less confident about managing risk in terms of veteran trees, it's really worth showing them this short film. So that's the end of those 2 units, and next time we'll be dealing with Unit 10 and Unit 12. And we haven't forgotten Unit 11, but Unit 11 is the biggest unit, so that will be done as a standalone webinar. See you next time. Thank you.